You're in the classroom with Cat Vo. In the Classroom is a podcast where we talk about all things teaching and learning, education and research. Join me as I sit down with everyday educators and explore what's going on in the field and what this means for sustaining us as teachers in the classroom. Today's special guest is Patty McGee. Patty is a literacy consultant from the United States and the author of Not Your Granny's Grammar, an innovative approach to grammar instruction. Join us in this conversation as we chat about why grammar should be taught as a creative tool rather than a list of rules, practical ways we can help students explore sentence structure, and how teachers can build their grammar knowledge without shame or perfectionism. Thanks for listening to In the Classroom. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Alrighty, everybody. So today we're in the classroom with Patty McGee. Patty, why don't we start with a bit about yourself and what the journey into education has been like for you and how you became so interested in grammar?
Sure. It's been a long journey. I've been an educator for 31 years, and it's been lovely. I haven't taken the road most traveled as an educator, and I feel like every time I made a shift, my father would be like, "Why are you doing this?" And I'd always end up just having something where I'm happier or I'm more inspired. So I started as a fourth grade teacher. I live in the US in New Jersey, right outside New York City. And my first job was actually teaching in the school that I went to. And my principal was my first grade teacher. And so it was like this little hometown loveliness. And from there, I got my library media certification. So I actually moved schools. Where I live are little tiny towns, like 4,000 people. And so I started as a librarian there, and it was also the school that my kids went to. So it aligned our schedules pretty much, which was really nice. And then where I live also is because of the small schools, there's two high schools that we send to. So I became a staff developer for the schools in our area called the Valley, and then beyond. And I ended up now with my own traveling teacher business and a few books under my belt. And it's been really lovely and just wonderful to meet so many educators from so many different places. And I still teach in the classroom, and most days I just don't have my own anymore. And then the second part of your question is how I came to grammar as something. It's because it was a miserable experience for everyone involved, whether I was a student and diagramming sentences, which I was quite good at. I was not able to really transfer that into my own writing. And that was almost humiliating to be given back my writing with all the corrections on it. And then teaching grammar, the only way I knew was worksheets and memorization. And there was nothing about application or even what I think of it now as artistry on the page. And so I've been on this 30-year journey of how can I rethink grammar instruction, and finally all these decades in, and I feel like I should say we, because there's two of us that wrote this book. We've got something that's been working, and so that's why we decided to publish it.
So, Patty, can we talk about that point about transferring that into writing? Because I feel like there are assumptions around grammar, particularly I've heard you say, there's this assumption that I've taught it. Why haven't you learnt it? And can you unpack those old ways, I guess, of, grammar teaching and how it might be different for you now with the new way, what that might look like?
Yes. Thus the title, Not Your Granny's Grammar. It's because I first started to look around at either moments where I was learning something deeply outside of school or conditions that I saw inside of school where learning was flourishing for both teachers and for students. And I realized that grammar instruction was missing a good portion of the things that we engage in when we learn. So I love to refinish furniture with this special kind of chalk paint called Annie Sloan chalk paint, and she uses these waxes. And I thought to myself, what do I do as I'm learning about this? What do I do as I'm studying this technique? And yes, I memorized, which is part of Granny's grammar, still part of, now. Yes, I identified, but that wasn't it. That wasn't the only thing. And really what I found myself doing was just hypothesizing, what could these paints look like on this particular piece, and then experimenting to see how that would look. And then just, on something that wasn't the furniture, reaching out for feedback from an expert, and then taking some time to reflect on what I was learning, and playing a lot with it to see really what I could come up with. And all of that was missing from grammar instruction. Also, let me also say that when I was learning different techniques for the paints and the waxes, I wasn't expected to use it the next day and be perfect at it. There needed to be that experimentation and that play and revising my thinking and really thinking like an artist. And that's really the big difference, that we've been looking at, that we've been playing with. We have more since we've published, but it's adding in hypothesizing about what is going on with this grammatical relationship, say, between simple and compound sentences, and then being taught directly, here's how you can turn simple sentences into compound sentences. And then having the chance to have a hands-on, I have manipulatives that I really like to use, a hands-on experience with playing and having somebody give feedback on, well, you almost have a compound sentence, you're just missing one thing. And then time for us to reflect, which reflection is the stickiest glue for our brains. So when we move on without saying, what have I learned? What am I still curious about? We're missing out on a very simple, very brief opportunity. And so that's one big shift of how we've been thinking about grammar. And the other big shift is, you started with transfer. So we've created an extended, not created, like we've thought up an extended transfer experience, because John Hattie's work, thank you for him. John Hattie's work he shows us that we learn in three phases. We learn in three phases. We learn surface first, deep learning, and then transfer. So we also study things in grammar in those three phases. So we'll start with some immersion, where we will hypothesize about maybe three different types of sentences. Then we'll go through this deep learning experience where we'll try a lot of that out with explicit teaching and hypothesizing and playing and reflection. And then the last part is preparing for transfer, where we create tools that we can use anywhere with any type of writing we're doing. And we've personalized those tools because we've co-created them. And then we loop them into our writing wherever that shows up. Like, I like to take, say, that first grammar unit that we study and bring those concepts into editing. And then the next writing that we do, bring it into revising, while we bring, say, the next study of grammar into editing, so that there's this cyclical application that we have for transfer. And it's slowed down the transfer process because grammar is art. Grammar isn't just a set of rules and expectations. Grammar is just like a painter's paintbrush. We never stop learning different techniques, different brush sizes, different strokes. It's the same with grammar. It's not immediately learned, and it's not ever fully learned.
Can you talk a bit more about the importance of grammar in context when it comes to embedding it in a unit and what your experience with that has been like? Because I would say that for some teachers, like myself, initially before I encountered anything related to grammar, I always thought of it as a set of decontextualized worksheets that if we're going to teach the compound sentence, we're going to whip out fanboys and give you, very, very dry, nothing linked to what you're learning kind of activities. So how have you seen grammar in context and what has that been like for you?
Well, first, to back up for a second and how we envision grammar playing a role during the school day is that we would have a 10-minute pocket of just time where we're exposing kids or kids are experiencing grammar. So similar to word study, we know that word study impacts reading and impacts writing. And so we give it its own practice time. And that's how we feel about grammar. Grammar impacts reading and it impacts writing. And so if we give it its own little pocket of time and allow the process of accumulation of grammar know-how, if we do that 3 to 5 times a week over, say, 6 weeks in a study, we're giving it the attention that it needs in order to then be able to teach it in context. I'm not saying we never teach it in context before. There's always a way that we can bring that in. But having something deeper, some deeper knowledge of how we use sentences, and that's always my favorite place to start, by the way, because they're the containers of all parts of speech and they're the building blocks of writing. And so when we have had lots of play and lots of experimentation, and it's not grammar in isolation, so to speak, especially because of the manipulatives that we suggest, that partnerships are talking grammar, they're moving parts and pieces around. I can share a couple of ideas of those with you. And then when we get to our own writing, we have at least a base of knowledge that we need to write in context. So if we don't know the difference or the relationship between simple and complex sentences and when and why we would use them, we'll spend 20 minutes with one student showing them that because that one student is ready. But if we have a study going on that we know is preparing us to transfer that type of learning into writing perpetually through the rest of the year and beyond, that's really where context, I think, is a perfect place to teach the grammar, but also that knowledge. It's like background knowledge in grammar. So it's just easier when kids are writing on the spot.
You used the word manipulatives before. Can you explain a bit to our listeners what you mean by that?
Sure. So similar to what we might use in math, like unifix cubes and counters and number lines and dice and things like that. And that was my very rudimentary try at something math. It's been a long time. We can have something similar in grammar. And that's where grammar play comes in. So we're playing with what perhaps sentence strips, words, manipulating them. And I'm going to give you some examples. And we're doing so with a partner. So we're having conversation about the concepts and where we think things should go. And because it is hands-on, there's like that physical touch to it in creating, but kids aren't expected to create off the top of their heads yet. So it's a really nice scaffold as well to application. And so one example of a grammar manipulative is something that we call sentences from a sentence. So the example I have used again and again, but there's many other examples, is a beautiful, luxurious quote from All American Boys by Jason Reynolds and co-author, which I should know his name. It's a beautiful sentence. So what we do is we print it large on paper, then we cut out each word and each piece of punctuation, and we ask kids to, with their partner, create as many sentences as they can, and they can reuse the words and punctuation as many times as they want to. And so together, it's very simple. It's free to do that, to just print something out enlarged and cut it. And together they're talking about, oh, well, this would be a sentence because, or, oh, we've got a comma here and we have one of the fanboys. So there's a chance we could probably make a compound sentence. And it feels like play because that's what it is. And there is a difference between games and play. Games, there's a winner and loser, and there's already enough shame involved with grammar that we do not need to bring that in. But play is where we have some tools, but we don't know what the outcome is going to be. And that outcome can be different from group to group. And so something simple like that is just one example of the manipulatives that I love to use. And kids love it too.
I love that so much. Patty, can you explain a bit about your thinking? Let's say if I was planning a lesson tomorrow and I'm new to grammar. I know nothing about grammar, but I've been told that I have to teach complex sentences. And let's say that that's the objective that I've been given, that I need to teach complex sentences. Where would you start in terms of, hypothesis, building that curiosity with students? I've seen a bit of your work with the destroyers. So can you walk our listeners through that about how,
Sure.
how would I be teaching complex sentences? What are some ideas that you would have?
So the first thing before you even begin to teach it is to come at it with a beginner's mindset. For those of us who are grammarians, we are very blessed. I shouldn't even include myself in that. Tim, my co-author, grammarians are like, I'm not sure if you read this book in your neck of the woods, but The Giver by Lois Lowry, where there's somebody who is holding on to all of the memories of the community, and then they bequeath them to Jonah, a young boy who's going to hold on to them. And that's how I think about grammarians, that they are the giver and the giver. And I'm thankful for that. And at the same time, as we're thinking about teaching something that we may not know a lot about, or we may not remember, which is the majority of us, I want to point that out. I have done lengthy anecdotal research, and the majority of educators do not know grammar in a way that makes them feel confident to teach it. So no shame there. Like most of us are in the same boat. There's a reason I have a co-author, because he's the grammarian in the duo. So that's the first step, is to just take the pressure off and turn to a beginner's mindset. Get curious with your students. And so let's say we're teaching simple and complex sentences, which I like to teach things that we can compare to each other. And we ask kids in one 10-minute pocket, just theorize. What do you think is the same and different about them? What relationship do you think they have? What have you noticed simply about simple sentences versus complex sentences? I usually walk around the room, jot down some things I hear, and that's it. Like, that's going to feel weird for most people because this isn't a mastery time. This is just simply an experience. And then the next time we do grammar, and this is where someone might need to do a little research, but not to be a book promoter here, but I just have to say, the back of this book, Tim wrote a whole grammar refresher for all the concepts that anyone would need to be able to teach them. And then if it's still confusing, he recorded himself teaching them. So, there's a model, there's an explanation, there's a model. You could use it like Khan Academy and have Tim's videos, do some of the heavy lifting for that. But that second day to do some explicit teaching. And yes, we like to call subordinating conjunction sentence destroyers, because whenever you put one in front of an independent clause or a simple sentence, it's no longer an independent clause. It's a dependent clause. So it has destroyed that sentence. So we teach kids when to use the sentence destroyers and when to use the comma, because sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. But we're, again, not expecting mastery. The next day or two, I really like 2 days of the play, we might give, as another manipulative, some sentence strips. And those sentence strips have already been completed of only simple sentences. And then, they could be cut out. We would then also have something we could cut out where it has a number of the sentence destroyers on there, probably the most commonly used ones, if this is the first kind of grammar study kids are going through. And then we'll have a couple commas to cut out, and students will then make their own complex sentences with the sentence destroyers. They'll write them down in their notebooks. Maybe they'll give themselves pointers on how to remember that. They'll sometimes move from that is a complex sentence, but it doesn't make sense. So while it is structurally sound, how can we change it so it does make sense and it's the right relationship between the simple sentences? And then a final day, again, 10 minutes, we pause and we say, what do we know about complex sentences? What do we still want to learn, or what are we curious about? And the things that come out of kids, curiosities, always tickle me. I always hear, well, we know independent clauses and dependent clauses. Can you have more than one independent clause with a dependent clause? Could you have 3 independent clauses? Could you have 3 dependent clauses? And it's just that kind of curiosity around grammar is the spark and the fuel for making this experience the opposite of what many of us experienced as students.
It's so true. And that element of shame is just not there for our students because they are given the opportunity to ask those questions. And I think for a lot of our teachers that are listening, language knowledge does come with a lot of shame and guilt for the fear of not knowing language and grammar. And I think my question to you, Patty, is for teachers that really want to upskill in this area. You have a great book, and that's an amazing resource that you have. What advice or what pointers or what other entry points would you suggest for our teachers?
Yes. So a few entry points would be to think of grammar and related grammar concepts in units of study. We've heard units of study in writing, units of study in reading, a unit in science on the water cycle, and there's an intentional progression that happens in those units. And if we think about entering into learning grammar in units where there's multiple related concepts that really matter to each other, those connections will come even faster. I also think an entry point is a little bit of, it really is like mindset. This doesn't have to be perfect. We educators are so good at striving for the perfect lesson, the perfect outcome. This is what we were taught to do. The perfect mastery through what we just magically brought forth. And I think we need to shed that. I also think another entry point is to keep it as simple as possible. I know we're all about our tech these days, but I think it's going to be, and I've seen it, low tech, no slides, make charts, paper, notebooks, conversation. There's really not a lot that you need. And anything you don't know about grammar, there's the internet. It's just going to show it to us. So if we feel like we need to have a little refresher, there's no shame in that. Go get a refresher. Go to Grammar Girl, and she'll explain things to us. And so those are a bunch of mental entry points.
Yep. Oh, I love that. I love that. For a person, Patty, that is thinking about, let's say, a whole school approach, they've been tasked with you have to you have to have a whole school approach to literacy. You're responsible for that. And if they want to think about grammar as the first starting point, and as you said, embedding that within whole units of study, what would be the best way to go about that? What would you be suggesting that they tackle that task? Is it going into their units, looking at all the different grammar points? Could you speak a bit into that space?
Yes. So I believe that the first kind of phase of that is the chance to re-envision and also see what this approach can be. Because it's really hard to shed something that's been kind of like at our cellular level because we've been taught that way for so many years. So I think the first most important part is to either experiment as a grade level team or in some way just see how this works. There's a rhythm to it. There's a pattern to it. So see the whole picture first, and then start to dive in to almost like like I said, a pattern of lessons once you've decided on your focus. So let's say your focus is quotations. When we use quotations and different punctuation, we would start off by following that 3-stage plan. We'd get curious about what other authors do with their quotations and punctuation. And then we might study dialogue tags. We might study how to quote a piece of text. We might study the difference between the two, when and how we might do that. And then we might create a tool that can help us as we go to that in our own writing. And so putting together whole school change, I do think it needs to come in increments. But the first increment is being able to envision what this experience looks like, because it is shockingly simple. It really is shedding a lot of stuff. We don't do most of the talking. We give the experience and we coach into that. The time that we do most of the talking are those days that we're explicitly teaching how to do something. And so whole school change, and I can share this with you and you can put it in the show notes. I really believe in having a document that grounds everything. I usually call it a professional learning plan. So it's like, if we're going whole school on grammar instruction, here's the goal. Here are the phases we're going to focus on professionally. And here are the opportunities that will be available to you to adopt this into your classroom.
So good, Patty. To close, Patty, if teachers had to take away one concept or idea from our conversation today, what would your hope be for that?
If I could say 2, because the first one's kind of negative, like we just need to get rid of the worksheets and identification. That is only completion. That is not building knowledge, or it's maybe even assessment of knowledge. But let's just see how we can let go of that. And then the more positive of like the good stuff to pull in is let and support kids in being curious about how language works. We don't need to have all the answers, but if we start with a curious stance, there's so much more investment and learning that happens from there.
So good. Well, Patty, that brings our conversation to an end. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and for sharing your expertise with us today. Thanks for listening to this episode of In the Classroom. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe, rate me 5 stars, and leave a review. Don't forget to share this episode with anyone who might find it inspiring. That's all from me, and I'll see you next episode. Thanks for listening to In the Classroom.